So today's video is a continuation of our discussion on Kripke's theory of proper name. Today I'm going to highlight two important caveats that Kripke introduces um, that tend to make the notion of rigid designator a bit more complicated. It's very crucial to illuminate these two warnings of Kripke that he introduced in his lecture. So, number one, an object denoted by a designator does not have to exist in all possible worlds. That means we can imagine a possible world in which uh, the proper name designates nothing. For example, Benjamin Franklin it's a proper name. Oh, so we can imagine a possible state of situation where uh, the proper name Benjamin Franklin designates nothing. And why Kripke is making us aware of such particular um, particular intricacy of proper name and rigid designator. So in order to clarify the ambiguity regarding rigid designator, we need to understand this particular point. We can understand it with reference to a particular example. Consider the example Hitler. Hitler is a proper name, it's a designator, and it designates a fanatic fascist leader. So the statement, if Hitler had not existed, then Second World War would not occurred. Okay, so you know it's this proposition is talking about a fascist fanatic leader and evaluating a claim with respect to a world in which that individual, the person denoted by that proper name, did not exist. So in order for us to make sense such a counterfactual situation, we need to allow the designator to designate the object with respect to a world in which it did not exist. That object simply does not exist. I'm repeating it again. An object denoted by a designator need not to exist in all possible world, because there could be such possible world in which the proper name can it might happen that it designates nothing. In order to make sense such counterfactual situation, like I mentioned now, that if Hitler had not existed, then Second World War would not occur. So it's about this is about a fascist. This statement is about a fascist fanatical leader, and the proper name Hitler designates a fascist fanatical leader, and it's an evaluation of a claim with respect to a world in which that individual does not exist. So in order for us to make sense of such claim, we need to allow rigid designator we need to allow designator to denote an object with respect to a world in which that object or individual does not exist. Otherwise, how could we make sense of such counterfactual situation? We many a times keep on telling that if that uh, if that person would not have come in my life, if so and so, for example, if Smith have not come in my life, then my life could have been better. So how do we make sense of such statement? Because we are allowing the designator, the proper name, to refer to the same individual with respect to a world in which that person does not exist. Clear? So one by one we are trying to peeling off the ambiguities regarding propernym and rigid designator. Secondly, we can imagine situations where the designator could have been used in different way. For example, another set of parent named a different person Benjamin Franklin. Okay. But it is not, I emphasize, it is not the way Kripke understands counterfactual situations. Another example I'm giving, we can also imagine a situation where Benjamin Franklin's parents named him Richard, gave him a different name, for example, Richard. Okay, and so his parent decided to name him Richard, and suppose that there was also at the same time a potato farmer in a mine named Benjamin Franklin. So in that situation, the name Benjamin Franklin designates a potato farmer in mine, and so in that counterfactual situation, Benjamin Franklin was a potato farmer in mine and not a statesman in Philadelphia. Remember, these are the misunderstanding of Kripkean notion of possible world or possible state of situation or counterfactual situation. It is not the issue how people use counterfactual situation. We are in the counterfactual situation, we are imagining, use the name Benjamin Franklin. So when we are imagining such counterfactual situation, for example, a different set of parents named a different person Benjamin Franklin, or Benjamin Franklin's parents decided to name him Richard, or some other person, for example, a potato farmer, his parent named him Benjamin Franklin. So these are the situations that we can very easily imagine how a designator can be used differently. Okay, we have freedom to imagine the different usage of a designator. We are talking about the designator Benjamin Franklin in this discussion. But these are all misunderstanding of what Kripke calls counterfactual situation, because it is not an issue how people in the counterfactual situation we are imagining used the name Benjamin Franklin. So we use the name Benjamin Franklin to denote, to pick out the same individual in different counterfactual situation. I emphasize, we use the proper name Benjamin Franklin to pick out the same individual in different counterfactual situations. Okay, and then attempt to answer questions about the individual, about that individual in question. So hence, with respect to possible world and under discussion, there is certain evaluation that I am not going to cover. So by now what we understood, an object denoted by a designator need not to exist in all possible world, and we got clarification about counterfactual situations, Kripkean sense of counterfactual situations. So the ambiguity in rigid designator there are three ambiguous senses of rigid designator. There are three senses of rigid designator. Which one is the Kripkean sense of rigid designator? This we need to understand now. So now we are in a position to understand the exact sense of rigid, exact meaning of rigid designator. Kripkean sense of rigid designator. Now we are in position to understand Kripkean notion of rigid designator. So Kripke seems to use the term rigid designator ambiguously. It seems to use, but let's see. As we now mentioned that three different readings are there. Number one, a designator is rigid in every possible world. Okay. Number two, a designator is rigid in every possible world in which that object exists. I repeat, in the first sense, what we are doing now, we are trying to understand the ambiguities that lies in the notion of rigid designator, and once we understood the ambiguities, we shall then eliminate the ambiguities so as to arrive at Kripke's understanding of rigid designator. All right. That's why first we need to understand the ambiguities. So the first ambiguous notion is a designator is rigid in all possible worlds. This is one of the senses of rigid designator. And the secondly, a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds in which that object exists. Lastly, there is another sense. A designator is rigid if it designates the same object in every possible world in which that designator designates anything at all. Carefully listen. The first sense, it requires reiteration so as to explicit the ambiguities underlying the notion of rigid designator. The first sense is a designator is rigid in all possible worlds. A designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds. I may have a little mistake while uttering the first sense of rigid designator. Pardon. So the first sense is a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds. And in the second sense, a designator is rigid in all possible worlds in which, follow carefully the clause, there is a clause, in which a designator is rigid in all possible worlds in which that object exists. In which that object exists is the additional clause added to this second sense of rigid designator. And in the third sense, a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in every possible world in which the particular designator designates anything at all. So here the clause is in which the designator designates anything at all. So in order to understand the intricacies of the three different senses or ambiguous senses of rigid designator, we need to understand it through an example. Let's take an example. The politician Nixon. I'm talking about this example, particular example. The politician Nixon. This is a designator. A designator is what a designator is something that designates anything, that denotes anything. Okay. Attributively, I am taking the designator, the politician Nixon. If you follow, you could understand that it is actually a construction of a proper name, Nixon, and a definite description. The politician. It begins with the politician, and Nixon is a proper name. So here, to understand and to eliminate the ambiguities of rigid designator, I am trying to understand it through an example, and that example I am using is the politician Nixon. And this example, the particular designator, is constructed by a definite description and a proper name. And let's see, is it at all a rigid designator, and in which sense it is a rigid designator. And that will actually clarify Kripkean notion of rigid designator. Have patience. Okay, so the politician Nixon, is it a rigid designator in the first sense? You think a bit, then answer. In the first sense of rigid designator, I mentioned a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds. It is not rigid in the first sense, the politician Nixon, because in the first sense, the implication is that it may not exist in all possible world. So the object denoted by the designator may not exist in all possible world. So this is the implication of the first sense of rigid designator. Okay. So the example, the politician Nixon, is not rigid in the first sense, because the first sense clearly implies that the object denoted by the designator may not exist in at least one possible situation. So let's say if it is rigid in the second sense, ask yourself, what was the second sense of rigidity of proper name? Okay, the second sense goes as a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds in which that object exists. Yeah, the politician Nixon, it is not rigid in the second sense as well, because Nixon may exist, but Nixon, we can imagine such situation where the designator, the politician Nixon, may denote Nixon. It may designate the person Nixon, but we can imagine very well the counterfactual situation wherein Nixon did not go to politics. He never went into politics. He was a druggist. So here the politician Nixon denotes no one in the second sense of rigid designator. Now let's see in the third sense. The third sense says a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds in which the designator designates anything at all. So the politician Nixon designates the same object in all possible world in which the designator designates anything at all. Yes, it fits the second sense of rigidity. Okay. So we could understand the designator, the politician Nixon, is not a rigid designator. Because, why? Because it does not designate the same object in all possible world? First of all, okay, and because there could be a possible world in which it may not exist. There could be another possible situation in which Nixon exists, but he is not a politician. He never went into politics. So it is not a rigid designator. It is a designator, but it does not designate the same object in all possible world. So rigidity in third sense is should be ruled out. Okay. So what are the Kripkean sense of rigid designator? Then in our hand currently we have the two senses of rigid designator. A designator is rigid in all possible worlds. A designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible world. This is the first sense, and the second sense is a designator is rigid if it designates the same object in all possible worlds in which it exists. Now, as we mentioned just now, that we, in order for understand, in order for us to understand, in order for us to make sense of such counterfactual situation in which an object or an individual does not exist, we need to allow designator to denote an object with respect to a world in which that object or that individual does not exist. Consider the example again. If if a person like name call Smith, if that guy Smith had not existed in my life, then my life could have been better. Or another example, if Hitler had not existed, then World War II would not occur. So in order for us to make sense of such counterfactual situation with respect to a world in which that individual does not exist, we need to allow designator to designate an object or an individual with respect to a world in which that object does not exist. So this is the Kripkean sense of rigid designator. We must allow the designator to designate an object with respect to a world in which that object does not exist. Got it? So what is the Kripkean sense of rigid designator and the ambiguities underlying the notion of rigid designator? And we could very easily able to eliminate the ambiguous notions of rigid designator, and we finally arrived at Kripkean intended meaning of rigid designator. Kripke's intended rigid designator. So it seems plausible to maintain that proper names are rigid in all three senses so long as we allow a designator to designate an object with respect to a world in which that object does not exist. Given that understanding, Kripke probably intended rigid one to be the sense he intended. So finally, it seems pretty clear that Kripke did not intend every designator that is rigid in the third sense to count as a rigid designator. As I mentioned, that the politician Nixon is not a rigid designator because it does not designate the same object in all possible world. Okay, how and why just mentioned now, I just described. So for a rigid designator should follow its designatum in every possible world in which that object exists. So that is, to rigidly designate Nixon, a designator should designate him in every counterfactual situation. So the proper name Nixon is definitely a rigid designator because it designates the same object in all possible worlds, even if there is no one designated by the proper name Nixon. whereas whereas the designator, sorry, whereas the designator, the politician Nixon, is not a rigid designator, because we can imagine a situation where Nixon never went into politics, but he happens to be a Dougist. That is why it's not rigid. So rigidity in third sense is not rigid. It's just ambiguous understanding of rigid designator. So the first sense is the sense that Kripke intended. Alright. Hope that I could convey the Kripkean idea of rigid designator. We'll see you in the next video with a bit more clarification on this topic.